Hi, I'm Ken Brusso. I'm often asked, where does this decision style model come from? What were the events that led up to it? How did we get to be what it is today? So in answer to those questions, I'm going to take you on a bit of a tour. I've got a presentation I put together for you on this. I'm going to take you on a quick tour of the key events and stages that led to the development of the decision style model. It all goes back to the era immediately following the Second World War, when the key question on researchers' minds was, how could apparently intelligent, sane people do the insane things that were observed before and during the war? At that time, the dominant psychological framework was Sigmund Freud's model, in which behavior was seen as a result of a struggle between the superego, social morals, and the ego, primitive impulses. But Freud's model was not considered adequate to explain the extreme range of behaviors that had attracted attention. Consequently, there was a series of developments of new conceptual models, and one of the first ones was presented by Theodor Adorno and his colleagues. And Adorno and his colleagues published a book called The Authoritarian Personality. The authoritarian personality was viewed as an extremely simple and rigid way of thinking. It involved identification with power and authority, scapegoating of the minorities, especially Jews. And it was contrasted with its opposite personality, the democratic personality. The authoritarian personality was considered to be an outcome. It would arise as a result of severe child-rearing practices or early childhood deprivation experiences. Adorno and his colleagues created an assessment to measure the authoritarian personality called the California F scale, where F stands for fascism. So the conceptual framework was a useful advance, but it was limited in that there were a couple of problems with it. One, it was clearly focused on a negative way of thinking, a bad way of thinking, good, bad. So that limited its applicability to human thinking in general. And the other thing was that it confounded with the structure and process of thinking and the contents of thinking. For example, the structure and process is very rigid, simple, black-white thinking, but it will also involve content, anti-Semitic attitudes, for example. So that was one of the limitations. But nonetheless, it does serve as a building block to other developments. The next one to come along built upon the authoritarian personality. It was presented by a psychologist named Milton Rokeach, and he published a book called The Open and Closed Mind in the early 1960s, and his focus was on dogmatism, dogmatic thinking. Dogmatic thinking was not necessarily simple like the authoritarian model. It could be, in fact, quite complex, but nonetheless, it was rigid, closed to external input, rejecting any input that would be inconsistent with a person's prior experiences and a narrow set of values. It was nonetheless free of content. There was no content presented as part of the model. So according to Rokeach, it could just as easily apply to the far left of the political spectrum as it could to the far right. But that also reflects one of its limitations in that it was far. It was an extreme way of thinking. So therefore, there are a lot of other forms of human thinking and cognitive behavior that it was not in any way adequate for explaining or even defining. The next stage of development was a very important one. It involved the development of the concept of style. particularly cognitive style. And the person who developed and presented the first edition of the concept of style, cognitive style, was a psychologist named Herbert Witkin, who worked at State University in New York and also later on at the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey. He originally presented the idea of cognitive style in the late 40s, but it was only in the early 60s that the idea of style began to gain traction. In Witkin's case, he was focusing on two styles, two very different styles. One he called field-dependent thinking, and the other field-independent thinking. And the distinction is this: field-dependent thinking involves a person forming beliefs and perceptions based strictly upon that person's personal experiences and on the particular context in which those experiences took place. Field-independent thinking, as it might imply, is more independent of context and personal experience and involves more analytic, abstract, conceptual thinking, and it is therefore more applicable to a wider range of behavior, especially in that the field-dependent model and the field-independent model anchor two ends of a continuum in which people array out from one extreme to the other. One end is anchored by field-dependent thinking. The other end is anchored by field-independent thinking, but people could exist anywhere on the continuum. And he even suggested that people can move along that continuum, so they aren't necessarily stuck in just one place. It's an important aspect of the the concept of style. So this was a very important advance in that it focused strictly on process, free of any content, but is still limited a bit by a value bias that seemed to favor independent thinking as superior to field-dependent thinking. The next edition, next chapter, so to speak, arose in the Princeton University Behavioral Laboratory, in which researchers Harvey, Hunt, and Schroeder developed what they called a stage model of conceptual personality. Harvey, Hunt, and Schroeder described four hierarchical stages. Level one was defined as a simple, dependent, closed way of thinking. And that contrasted on the other end of the spectrum with level 4, which is complex, independent, and open to input. But in between those two extremes, they defined a couple of other stages as well. So it was an advance in that it differentiated more modes of thinking, but it still had a bit of a value bias. Level 4 was clearly seen as better than level 1. Work continued at Princeton University. And one of the researchers of the Harvey, Hunt, and Schroeder trio was Harold Schroeder, and he joined forces with Michael Driver and Siegfried Streufert, and they published a book called Human Information Processing. This is a very key event here. That was in 1967. And in so doing, they focused on the process of analytic integrative thinking as defined by information use and information processing behavior. So they explored the impact also of let me back up a bit here. They specifically addressed the fit between this integrative way of thinking and particular tasks and situations. So it was an early situational fit model of human thinking. They also explored the impact of environmental pressure on thinking, the immediate environment in which thinking takes place. So here again, a person's thinking was not considered to be a fixed pattern. It could move, and it would move in relation to pressures and stresses in the environment. So it was really the first model of human thinking to address both situational fit and environmental dynamics. And here again, it focused strictly on the process of thinking. It's content and value free. So in the late 60s and early 1970s, Michael Driver, one of the Schroeder, Driver, and Streufert trio, had joined the faculty at the University of Southern California, where he and his colleagues developed a full two-dimensional model of decision-making that is based upon one, information use, and the new dimension of solution focus. So in combining those two dimensions, they were able to define the four key decision styles of decisive, flexible, hierarchic, and integrative. In so doing, they expanded perceptions of situational fit and environmental dynamics. In this case, there is no assumption that any one of those four styles is any better than any of the other styles. It's all about situational fit. So it's strictly a situational fit model of human thinking. And it's focused entirely on the process of thinking, content and value-free. And again, no assumption that any one person or any one style is any better than any other. And furthermore, the view was that because of the environmental pressures and stresses, people's thinking could shift across those four styles as they were exposed to different levels of pressure and stress. Driver and his colleagues created an early paper and pencil version of the decision styles assessment. People would respond to a questionnaire, mark their answers on an answer sheet, turn those answer sheets in, then they'd have to be key punched into computer cards and run through a computer. But it was an early attempt at automating an assessment of human thinking. The next and the last chapter I'm going to talk about here is when I arrived at the University of Southern California and joined forces with Mike Driver. We became close research collaborators and consulting partners. And in so doing, we added the last conceptual development to the decision style model, which I believe is really the most important one, in that we made a distinction between interpersonal role styles and operating styles. There's still the four styles, four interpersonal decision styles, four operating styles. And the distinction we were making was based upon the observation that people often behave dramatically differently in situations that are relatively formal, like a big meeting or when they're dealing with people with whom they're not very familiar, as distinct from how they behave and think when they're by themselves or they're doing something and they're working with just a couple or a small number of close associates with whom they're very familiar. That's operating style. They're just at that point going through things pretty much as a matter of habit. Mike and I then expanded research on the fit between different kinds of situations and these four styles, studying hundreds of thousands of executives and managers around the world. And we refined the notion of having to do with how styles would shift and change under different levels of what we called environmental load. Unfortunately, Mike Driver died in 2004. So I carried the work on and created the fully automated online version of the style view assessment that you may be familiar with now. And also building on the work that Mike and I did together, I developed numerous applications of the style view assessment that range from career advisement to executive search to team alignment. So there are many different applications of the model. And that's pretty much the end of my presentation. So I hope it's been informative, and I thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation to you today. Thank you.